Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the slot board panel. This is our first live panel in person. The previous one we had was all online, so it's great to see everybody here in person and on stage. So it's a sign that we are coming together in person, and hopefully we'll keep this format for the future. It was very much appreciated by all our colleagues previously to have the opportunity to get to know the people on the slot board and put the faces with the names and with the image on Microsoft Teams. So, and also thanks very much to the people who have volunteered to come on this panel. These are all your colleagues who represent your associations and also the industry on the slot board panel. So we have Petra Popovac from Airport Coordination Australia, Irene Garcia from AINA in Spain, Steve Rowe from New Zealand, João Pita from Sao Paulo Airport, who is also the chair of the slot board, Fred Wister from Norway Slot Coordination, and Chris Carter from British Airways. This is the slot board last term. Sorry, not last term. It's the end of the first term of the slot board. As you know, we have created this structure back in 2020, and we all started in this virtual world, trying to do so many things and dealing with the crisis. And now when the slot board first term expires, we thought it's also very good for you to know what has been achieved so far, but also on reflection from the slot board members, perhaps what could have been done better and how do we see the future of this structure moving forward. So starting with the first question on what the slot board is currently doing and what are the working groups that are currently ongoing, I would like to ask Petra first. There is a working group on series length that has just started this March, coming as one of the priorities from the slot board to be looked at. This topic has also been discussed in the strategic review. So Petra, can you give us a little bit more information as to what is this group all about, what are you doing, and what sort of issues and discussions you have with your colleagues? Thanks.
Wrong microphone. Thanks, Dimitar. Appreciate that. So yes, as Dimitar said, the working group started in March. Obviously, with everything that's happening, it started online, and we had our first in-person meeting a few days ago here in Seattle. So what we're looking at in the series length working group is looking at how series affects efficient allocation of the facilities at the airport. As you all know, our jobs are to most efficiently allocate the available capacity, and series length plays a part in that as well. So we're looking at how shorter series and longer series affect the efficient allocation of slots. We're also looking at whether in the future we're looking at whether the number of slots in a series is valid and right. And to do this work, we've put together a methodology, and we're looking at one airport to start off with and one season, and then from there, once we've tested the methodology to make sure that the data that we've collected and the analysis that we've done makes sense, then we'll expand that to other airports and further seasons. So to start off with, the first airport that we've chosen is Barcelona. So I thank my Spanish colleagues very much for putting their hand up and volunteering for that. And the season will be summer 19. So there was a lot of chat also about what points in the calendar we should use for this analysis and what makes sense. In the beginning, to start off with, we're going to use the main 4 points of the calendar, which is the SHL, the SAL, the SRD, and the end of season. And after we've done the initial analysis, we'll see whether that still makes sense or whether we can use less or whether we keep the 4 main points of the season as well. We had some really good discussions on Sunday, or Monday, whenever it was. The airlines presented for about 2 hours a presentation on how fragmentation is built into their schedules. And we all found that really, really interesting. Next time we meet, the coordinators are going to provide a presentation on how fragmentation occurs during the allocation process. So that's also going to help with the initial analysis for the first airport and then for the following airports after that. So we see that this work may take a little bit of time. So we'd love to finish in November, but I don't think that's going to be an option. So we're just going to take our time and do our best to be able to provide some answers and some data that is meaningful and realistic, so we can make some decisions on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Now, moving on to another working group that the slot board has set up. This one has taken maybe a year to look at different issues. So I would like to turn to João to give us an update where the group on pre-HBD cancellations and justified non-use of slots is at the moment, and if you can just give a little bit more insights as to what has been discussed and where the group is at the moment.
No, thank you and good morning. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and this is a very good setup for us to discuss and to present some of the work to the other participants of the conference, and hopefully we can do this in the other conferences as well. You choose an easy group for me to comment, right? So pre-HBD cancellations is the very famous double dip for some of you there. There is that fancy words about pre-HBD, but you know, in more informal environments we can call it double dip. And then we have the justified non-use of slots, the genus as well. So this is a group that has been working for the last year, but even before that, during the strategic review between 16 and 19 is also one of the topics that were dealt with at the time. And of course, we continue to work on that with airlines, airports, and coordinators to find out the right balance between the realization of the 8722, the need for that, in the view of some of the stakeholders, or why that perhaps is not needed anymore in the view of other stakeholders, and I will get there in a minute. And of course also the definition of what is in fact and in reality a justified non-use of slot, right? So if you are a coordinator or an airline or even an airport expecting a flight, at the end how you can see and how we can be sure and be comfortable that a flight has not occurred due to an unforeseen situation. And so we have different positions, and sometimes I think this is quite good, and also doing some analysis here about the work of the board and the working group. So after a year and after extensive discussion between the three parties and after some meetings of the board where we welcome the effort from the group and we ask them to continue to push for a joint agreement, that was not possible yet, because the board is here to stay, and of course groups close and others will be open, but for the time being we decided that this group has done their fair share of work, and we are asking the group to give a final report to the board by the next meeting. And so what are the main takeaways of this? So we can see that both coordinators and airports, they feel now that 8722, the double dip or pre-HBD cancellations, they should no longer occur, and that paragraph should be taken out of the guidelines. So it is the feeling that there is enough flexibility in other parts of the guidelines, and that you know, that might be something that was there in the past for very good reasons, but that in a new environment and in a new world, this is something that we could live without. Airlines also for very good reasons. They believe that for their operational purpose, fleet issues. You know, when they submit a slot portfolio and their requests, there are changes and there are adjustments that could be done until HBD, and so it would be important to keep 8722. So as the positions were not reconciled, and of course then there was from the airline side also saying that, you know, then let's look at Genius. So there are then other justified non-use of slots that we can see and maybe at some extent not compensate, but we can look at differently also on the Genius definition. And that was the part where both coordinators and airports were a little bit unsure, but how to change it and how to change it in a way that doesn't leave it too open for the airlines, but at the same time, of course, we are also aware that the airlines have moments that they cannot fly their flights. So I think bottom line was that the discussion was amazing. I think that everyone at the group did a wonderful job. They were very clear, setting up their points of view and telling the others why they think A or B, but at the end, the board decided, and of course, to close the group without a final conclusion or recommendation. And I look forward to read the final report and then to see how in the future we can get back to this subject and try in a couple of months or years to try and reconcile positions again.
Thanks for that update, João. As you can see, the slot board and the working groups are really working on various options, discussing various positions. You know, opinions may not always be the same or meet, but we are doing our best to see with these discussions what sort of outcomes and lessons learned can be there for everyone. So quite a lot of also open topics perhaps in the future to see how the slot board is going to deal with those issues. Thank you, João. Now, I would like to ask Steve, who's involved in the third working group of the slot board, which was also created this March. This group is working on the use of slot and scheduling data and also the availability of information. So, Steve, can you give us an idea what is all about the data and what is this group working on at the moment?
Yeah, hi everyone. So our work group got together in March with a view. There you go. I hate the mics. Our work group got together in March to look at data sharing between airports coordinators and airlines, and how that information is shared and how it's used. So the initial meetings that we had, we just kind of gave a list of data that's out there. What data we would like, what information we would need, and really with a view that how can we do better planning going forward, helping the airports plan resources, manpower, and so on, and obviously the airlines drive that. From there, we had a lot of discussion on when should this data be shared, what should be shared, and so on. And obviously, we looked at things like SIM Chapter 6 and SIM Chapter 7 as a methodology of sharing that information, as well as various coordinators and airlines exchange different reports to each other. So can those be standardized and shared, more commonly across the various countries involved? And so for next steps, we're going to continue to go through all of the information that would be, I guess, desired, and how we best provide that.
Thanks, Steve. So these are the current working groups. Of course, when a group will take a little bit longer, I think the slot board has flexibility to allow this work to continue. This is something we have learned from the strategic review as well. If a working group needs to discuss more or base their elaborations on data or whatever information that they still require to look at, I think this is a good way for the slot board to analyze the intermediate reports of the working group and see where things are going. Now, with the next term of the slot board, there will be new working groups created once the priorities of the slot board for the next term are agreed. So I would like to use this opportunity again to remind everyone who's interested in joining those technical working groups to come forward and nominate themselves once we have agreed the priorities of the slot board. It's really helping everyone to have those people on board in the working groups, and it's also an opportunity for you to put your experience into and contribute to those working groups. Just as a side note, the slot board has just recently, on its last meeting, agreed on a procedure for allocation of priorities to ad hoc and read-time slots. This is another working group that has been working very hard recently. And the outcome of that working group will be published shortly, so that people can start looking at how to implement those priorities. Now, moving on to this term of the slot board that I mentioned is coming to an end. The last 3 years have been very difficult for aviation. And I think this is a sign that if we have gone and managed through such crisis, I think we are ready to rebound and face anything that may come up in the future. But it will be interesting to hear how the specific issues and challenges that the slot board has faced from its first day have been addressed, and how the slot board actually stepped in to help the aviation community in this unprecedented crisis. So turning up to Irene, the slot board had issued a number of recommendations and guidance in the beginning of the crisis. One specifically related to temporary capacity reductions. Can you give us some insights to that and how this was deemed helpful by the slot board? Because this was actually looked at in the end of 2020, so quite ahead of time.
Yes, thank you. I think this recommendation is interesting because it reflects very much how lucky we were to have the slot board created prior to this crisis. So when it was created, we were meant to meet physically, and we were strangers among us, and we were trying to put together a new way of work. And then COVID started, and even though it was extremely difficult, we had many virtual meetings, and it was complicated, to have this framework helped us to explain the difficulties that we were all facing, because it was the worst crisis for aviation, and all three stakeholders were facing unprecedented times. And this recommendation was carried out, and a working group that did wonderfully developed it, precisely to address an issue that we were facing at that point in time, which was the possibility of having to reduce capacity really quickly because of the new situation that was developing. So it's only addressed to very fluid situations, because in normal times, as there was establishes, capacity reduction should be avoided after initial submission deadline. So the recommendation mentioned the specific potential specific situations that could be faced at that point in time, such as governmental restrictions that imposed health checks, mandatory health checks, and had a downward pressure on capacity, or social distancing. This was a major issue for us airports. We were really worried about what it meant in terms of capacity, and the decisions by the regulators were being adopted very quickly, almost from one day to another. And the recommendation, which I think it's good for everyone to check, establishes a series of principles. For example, that the reduction should be done after a thorough demand and capacity analysis and in consultation with the coordination committee, etc. Also, that any mandatory schedule reduction should be done in a fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory manner, and that historics should be preserved, etc. It it also includes, I think it's good guidance for these kind of situations. So it establishes different options depending on how severe the reduction is. It determines the different roles of all the stakeholders, and it includes in an annex an example of a potential local rule in this line. So overall, I think it's a good reflection of how the slot board was able to work, because we were able to transmit, each one of us, what were our needs and what was the context we were facing.
Thank you for that reflection, Irene. Now turning to Fred, with regards to the guidance for retimed and ad hoc priorities that has just been approved by the slot board, can you provide us some background information on this issue, and how do you think this guidance will be helpful as we now are getting out of the crisis and we are in this recovery stage?
Yeah, thank you, Dimitar. This has really been a priority for the WASP in that sense that in going into the winter 22, and of course we have had this extraordinary situation that historics have been alleviated and then new carriers have built historics, and what should we do in that sense when that is happening. So what we have done is try to make a guidance from the WASP on the two types of priority concepts that will be provided to the coordinators. As you know, initial slot allocation priorities and management of the slot pool is covered in the WASG 8.3 and 8.4. And the priorities, of course, then is that the primary, or should we say basic criteria are first request for changes to historic slots, then new entrant requests, and finally the non-new entrant requests. And all that seems very simple, but in these times, difficult times we have had through COVID, it's been quite difficult with all the alleviations and how to calculate what's going on. So in the WASP, we have tried to come to an agreement that in addition to the normal rules, we will have like additional first priorities and secondary, or what we can call additional criteria. In this, after the historics, we have the highest priorities worked out to be for the year-round operations and series allocated on ad hoc basis in the preceding equivalent season. And this is something new if you compare it to the old historic, first the historics, of course, that operate comes out, and then this will be then the next that they have a priority in this. As a consequence of the slot relief measures during this time of the crisis. In addition, I would say that we have also then agreed on some kind of secondary or additional criteria that will count in, and I can mention some of them, not necessarily in particular orders, but it's like the effective period of operation, operational factors, time spent on the wait list, type of consumer service, and market connectivity. I think that's also something that we have to look more into. Also, a difficult point is competition, and of course environment is an issue, in addition to all kind of the local guidelines that we are now seeing. Finally, I would like to emphasize the importance that the coordinators and the facilitators within the scope of their legal national competence will work accordingly to give as much predictability and transparency in this process as would be possible. I think that should sum it up, and you mentioned it will also be distributed in the near future, so I think that should fill up that.
Thank you, Fred. I think the main outcome of this is at the slot board we are really trying to respond quickly and address the needs of the industry as we are being faced with many challenges and problems throughout this crisis that we have not even dreamt of in our worst nightmares that we will be faced. So I think this is one of the major roles of the slot board, also to provide the support needed to everyone, not only in these crisis times, but also look at how we can improve also in the future. And last but not least, I would like to now ask Chris to give us a little bit more overview on the slot alleviation measures. As you know, the slot board has approved several recommendations on slot alleviation for the past seasons. And just recently, the slot board agreed to recommend the extension of the market-based approach to slot alleviation measures for winter 22. And we have just recently published the so-called slot alleviation matrix to try and clarify a little bit more the slot board recommendation. So, Chris, can you give us a little bit more detail and an overview on this slot alleviation matrix, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dimitar, and good morning, everyone. I guess the main thing to say about the slot board recommendation for summer 22 and now winter 22 is that it recognises that different countries, different regions are recovering at different rates and reopening it in different ways. I mean, fortunately, traffic is bouncing back strongly, as traffic restrictions start to ease. But saying that, there are still lingering uncertainties related to COVID-related measures and other evolving issues and inconsistencies, shall we say, with the recovery that still warrant some degree of slot relief provisions. I think the key to everybody is that regulators decide what those provisions should be as early as possible so that we can all plan. And I mean, airlines, airports, all parts of the service chain need to plan as early as possible so that we can provide consumers with some degree of confidence. So therefore, the slot board has been trying to do that, to help regulators by providing guidance on what the appropriate measures might be for their own markets, whilst also taking into account the traffic mix and the exposure that those markets have with other markets. I think it's fair to say that the slot relief subject has taken up a large proportion, I'm just seeing if everyone agrees, of the slot board's time ever since its inception. Pretty much the whole time we've been together, we've been talking about slot relief. It is a subject that potentially can generate polarized views, but we've been working really hard within the various working groups that have been working on this to overcome that, and we successfully come up with a recommendation on each occasion. And each of those occasions, I think, is it up on the screen? Yeah. I mean, there are three, I guess, slot relief instruments that we've been considering in all of this. Obviously, one of those is reducing the slot use threshold, the slot utilization rate. And then there's the full series returns, which are designed to encourage early return of slots for ad hoc reallocation. And the thing about those two is that they provide clarity on the rules, and they allow us to plan and provide early sight of schedules. And of course, there's a third one, which is the enhanced justified non-utilization of slots, or JANUS rules. And that's an essential backstop, I guess, for emergent circumstances that prevent the recovery. for the first few seasons, we came up with one number for the slot use threshold and one recommendation for the full series return. But as we got into summer 22, it became clear that it was going to be very difficult to agree on one number for each of those, and that some kind of market-based solution would be necessary. So that's how we then ended up developing the framework that you now see before you. And I think one thing I would say about it is it kind of reflects how the pandemic has evolved. So arguably it could have been used right from the start. So where every country was pretty much in the same place, over on the left-hand side of the screen, and was severely restricted, that's covered. And now it's covering the fact that we have restricted markets still, we have reopening markets, and we have markets that are indeed open. So, potentially we have something here that could work for similar future situations. For summer 22, this was described in a very wordy format, which I think admittedly was very difficult for regulators to understand, right, Dimitar? Which is why for winter 22, we've now turned to develop this matrix style, which illustrates the slot relief measures of the four types of market. So it tries to still provide some element of consistency. So it's essentially inviting regulators to establish what type of market they are, and there are definitions that sit behind this, depending on existing levels of ongoing travel restrictions and health measures such as quarantine and testing requirements. Then within each market, it describes slot utilization rate and the kind of series return facility that regulators might want to consider, and that's within a range depending on their own circumstances and exposure to other markets. So, for example, I think I can't quite see it, but the slots utilization rate for severely restricted markets, I think, is in the range from 0, which is essentially full alleviation, up to 50-50, a 50-50 threshold, and whereas reopening, for example, is in the 60 to 70 range. And then on the full series return, it suggests for a severely restricted market that all historics would be eligible for full season alleviation, whereas as you go along, you get to reopening markets, and it's suggesting that should be capped to a certain amount of the portfolio. I think it says 20% on the screen there. I don't know whether it goes on. Have you got the second? Yeah. I mean, so the matrix goes on to provide further conditions and clarifications around things like, if a carrier is operating from a severely restricted market, how that carrier should be treated at the other end of the route if it's to a less restricted market. And then we've got things about how the full series of returns should be implemented and how the use it or lose it calculation should be made. And then there's things around how local regulations need to take precedent, obviously, over these recommendations, and how reciprocity should come into the thinking. I think finally there's a section in there around enhanced Janus for COVID-specific related measures. So that provides provisions around Janus alleviation for situations before the planned operation, and then so on an ex-ante basis. And then there's provisions around Janus alleviation for a recovery period, essentially, for up to six weeks. And I think that just about covers it. It's a complicated area, so hopefully I haven't confused everybody with that even more.
Thank you, Chris, for trying to clarify further the matrix. It's not a very easy thing to explain, especially to regulators. But thanks for that overview. And now I would like to ask João, as chair of the slot board, to share with us any reflections on this first 3-year term of the slot board, and any key messages or views to share with our colleagues here today.
Thank you. When we were preparing this, I was thinking, what should I say, right? And I think there are 3 elements that I want to bring. I mean, not 3 elements, but 3 dimensions of this. One is the expectation that we had in late 19, early 20, The other one is the reality that we faced. And last, but certainly not the least, to think about the future, right? What is coming. So I think what was the expectation? We went through 3 years of strategic review with more than 120, 130 people involved in a bottom-up approach of bringing new ideas, of getting long meetings during 1 or 2 days at each conference, outside of the conferences, produce reports, recommendations, vivid discussions. And so the board and the World Airline Slot Guidelines Edition 1 was pretty much the outcome of it. You know, there was solid discussions. We were thinking, what should we do for the next 3 years, 2022? There is an MOU signed by the members and the terms of reference of the board that set some priorities for us to discuss as a community, not as a board, but as a community, all of us here. And this was actually, I think, the plan, was to meet in Malaysia in March to set up the priorities and to move from there. But then there was the reality, right? The reality is that we had 26 or 27 calls during this time. We could only meet 3 times, right? Face to face. And the subject was, as Chris very well mentioned, pretty much about alleviation and COVID impact, right? No one knew in January, February, March, April 20 for how long and how deep COVID would affect our industry. So we were reacting to things that were actually happening every week and sometimes every day. So something that was true in May 20 was not true anymore in July 20. And so the board that was supposed to work at a steady pace with working groups and then, okay, we should meet in 3 or 4 months after, suddenly needed to meet every month. And we all know how short of staff we were in our own organization. So we were basically giving a significant amount of our time to the board. And please trust me, the table seems easy to do, but it was very hard to get there. So after being at a table like this, it seemed that pretty obvious that this is a good outcome, but to get there, it took us more than a year. So again, I think reality was that most of the work and most of our lives inside and outside the slot world were COVID related. And so the board work was also about that. But I want to take a note on this reality dimension about the members of the groups, and of course, and why not, for my fellow colleagues on the board. A big thanks for all of you that in very hard circumstances accept the challenge to work on the working groups, that keep move the board, that never gave up. And of course, if we had these results and the other working group results was absolutely because the members have done everything that they could to get to compromises. So again, a big thanks for all the members of the working groups and the board for their commitment over the last 2.5 years. And now the future, you know. The first term is about to end, but the second term is about to start, right? And there is always a refresh and a new beginning when you start new terms. So I invite you, all of you, not only you that are here at the room, but your colleagues that are doing coordination, the ones that are at home or at your own organizations, to participate, to collaborate, because when we have different voices, when we all participate, at the end the decisions typically are better than if they are just made by a handful of people. So again, I think the future will be to get back to strategic views, to how we can incrementally improve the process, how can the 3 stakeholders understand the needs of the industry, and who knows the needs of the industry if not each one of us, and then jointly decide what is the better for the future. And I think the last message would be that this is an industry-led industry, right? We need to be the ones leading this. So to lead also means to compromise. And I think to move forward, we need to be able to get into compromises so that at the end we can make the necessary changes to cope with an industry that is always evolving and changing.
Excellent. Thank you, João. Now, are there any questions from the audience or any comments? Anybody wants to use the opportunity today? Please be gentle to the panel. Okay, if there are no questions, you know who the slot board members are. Please do approach any of them or any of us who are involved from the secretariat in managing this structure. And thanks again very much to Petra, to Irene, to Steve, to Joao, and to Fred and Chris and all the other slot board members for the amazing contribution and the time, and wish you a great day, and hope to see you all, everyone in Melbourne. Thanks for coming.